I am going to introduce our speakers and roundtable panelists. Amanda Fallin-Bennett is an associate professor at the UK College of Nursing and co-founder of Voices of Hope, a recovery community organization in Lexington. Dr. Fallin-Bennett's program of research and teaching focuses on addiction treatment, recovery support services, and harm reduction. Jeremy Baird is a co-founder and CEO of Louisville Recovery Community Connection. Mr. Baird has supervised peer support specialists in a variety of settings, including a weekly statewide supervision and collaborative learning meeting with a cohort of peer support specialists working in primary care clinics across the state. He is a passionate advocate devoted to ensuring that all individuals with substance use disorders have access to evidence-based recovery support services, and a leader in the broader U.S. recovery movement. Jimmy Chadwell is a program manager for Wave 1 Sustainability at Voices of Hope, a certified recovery coach, adult peer support specialist, and a person in recovery. Jimmy was deployed as a recovery coach at the Franklin County Health Department Syringe Service Program during Wave 1 of the Healing Communities study. Ashley Berkshire first came to Voices of Hope as a participant, then recovery coach, and now is the Criminal Legal Systems Program Coordinator for Wave 1 Sustainability. Ashley also leads a monthly medication assisted recovery anonymous step study at Voices of Hope. Voices was the first place where I found a recovery community where I felt at home. I wanted to work here to help people who were like me, who felt like they never belonged in traditional recovery communities. Tai Oku-Bekun comes to the Healing Community Study as a program coordinator and was a recovery coach, adult peer support at Voices of Hope for almost 2 years. Tai spent 10 years in active chronic use of different substances, primarily opioids. She is currently identifies as a person in long-term recovery, as Tai just celebrated 4 years in recovery from all illicit substances and alcohol. She also identifies as a person who utilizes MOUD to treat her opioid use disorder. Tai is very active at Voices of Hope and extremely dedicated to her job, as well as helping those in the community find freedom from their SUD, OUD. She says, "It's funny, I found myself working in this field as it was never in my plans. It has brought me more joy, happiness, heartache, and contentment than I could ever have thought possible. The longer I'm in this field, the more it makes me want to continue elevating my education so I can continue to help others in broader and more advanced capacities. Someday I want to start my own 501(c) to assist pregnant women and new mothers in their journey to wellness." So thank you to all our speakers. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fallin-Bennett.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. None of the speakers have any relevant financial relationships to disclose, but I do have the conflict of interest that I'm both with the University of Kentucky and I'm a co-founder of Voices of Hope. So in terms of the practice gap and educational needs, peer support specialists, all the people who are joining me on the call, so who are experts in this, are individuals with substance use disorder in remission and recovery who provide non-clinical strengths-based support based on their own lived experience. The role of peer support specialists has grown exponentially in the U.S. in recent decades. So Georgia became the first state to begin billing for peer support in 1999. And as of 2019, over half of all facilities providing substance use disorder treatment in the United States provide peer support services. But despite this growth, peer support specialists report that other health professionals can undervalue or lack understanding of their job roles. And peer support specialists have sometimes reported difficulty establishing boundaries with participants and with work-life balance. So we're going to discuss the roles, functions of peer support specialists, describe best practices for training, supervision, and workplace support, and practices to increase connection between peer support specialists. So the expected outcome is that you will recognize the importance of peer support specialists in the provision of recovery-oriented services for substance use disorder, recognize appropriate job functions, and the importance of creating supportive spaces for peer support specialists to connect to one another and advocate for the profession. Okay, so what we are going to do today is turn it over so that you all can hear from people who are peer support specialists here at Voices of Hope. And so what I would ask is for everyone to put in the chat, if you could just put your job title. I feel like we do have a lot of peer support specialists in the audience, so we have a lot of expertise on the current topic, but it would be great just to see where you all are coming from. And I just wanted to start by letting the peer support specialists on the panel, they're going to speak about a positive experience that they've had receiving peer support. And this will also help you see some of the different ways that peer support can be delivered. So I'm going to start by asking Jimmy if you'll talk about what telephone recovery support is delivered by peers, and then kind of your experience with it.
Yeah, so here at Voices of Hope, we have a program that's called Telephone Recovery Support. And so the participants that are enrolled in our retention program and in other programs receive a supplementary phone call, which can be a few minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes long. And it's just a either volunteer in some capacities or another recovery coach that's assigned to that task. They'll reach out to their list of calls for the day or week. So that they'll call and check and say, hey, how's your recovery going? Do you need any resources right now? Is there anything I can help you with? If the individual that they're calling identifies a resource that they need, or they need to get a hold of their assigned recovery coach, our TRS individual perform the TRS calls, we'll reach out to the recovery coach so we can close the loop and keep that connection going and help them find any resources that they may need. And then Amanda was talking about a positive experience that I've had with peer support. I didn't actually have a peer support as far as like a full-time relationship where I was engaged in a peer support program, but I was a participant of TRS, which is telephone recovery support again. So the way that benefited me when I was in sober living in early recovery, I would get periodic phone calls. Those phone calls check, say, hey, how's your recovery going? It was an individual. I still don't even know who it was. I don't know if it was a volunteer at the time or one of our past employees. Amanda and I were talking. It would be funny if I knew who it was now that actually work here. But what that did for me was it made me recognize, and it was a reminder of the seriousness of my condition. So substance use disorder in general often can be a fatal condition, right? If the wrong circumstances happen, overdoses and things can potentially happen. So it reminded me of the seriousness of my condition. And I remember between 5 to 10 different phone calls for those weeks or months that I was a telephone recovery support participant. And I remember a few in particular where the individual just asked me how my recovery was going. I told them it was going fine, whether it was or not. The phone call was really short, but I remember when I got off the phone, I was like, wow, a stranger called me that I still to this day don't know who it was, right? And reminded me how serious it was to check up on my recovery. As far as like introspectively, the way I viewed how my recovery was going, and also conveying that to a complete stranger. So it made me realize the seriousness of my condition, and that I needed to stay on top of my recovery goals and the outlook for my recovery. So it was really impactful for me, and I didn't even have a full-time peer support specialist. So
Thank you, Jimmy. So telephone support is one way that peer support is delivered, and then another way would be through peer-led meetings. And so Ashley is going to share about her experience when she first came to Voices.
Yeah, I actually just realized last night, the first time I ever came to Voices it'll be 2 years and 2 days. And I came here they offered a grief support group. I came into recovery this time, like right after losing my boyfriend to overdose. And, I was just totally alone. I was brand new in Lexington. I was basically felt just broken. And so I found that they had this group here, and I was leery at first because I'd had really bad experiences at a lot of different like recovery support services. But coming here, it was just completely different. And, everyone was welcoming. There was no judgment. And it was really just life-changing for me just to have find one place out of like all the places I've looked to finally feel like I belonged here, and it made a huge difference in my life.
And Ty, can you talk about what it's like to receive recovery coaching?
So I first received recovery coaching when I was in Fayette Drug Court through Voices of Hope, and it was a great opportunity. I took my recovery seriously, but it allowed me to make goals and have somebody hold me accountable for those goals at a different level. And that someone was worried about my recovery just as much as I was. And so he no longer works here, but he was a pinnacle part of my recovery for those first 2 years. And I can't say enough about the recovery coaching aspect of it.
So Jeremy, can you talk more broadly about the different ways that peer support services can be delivered?
Sure. Just thinking about the therapeutic value of, peer supports and that lived experience and what they bring throughout the years over the last decade, really, maybe even less, since about 2016, probably, we've been seeing the emergence of peer supports, recovery coaches being in an array of, diverse settings, whether that's, EDs, emergency departments, emergency rooms, being there to support folks who have been reversed from overdoses, or people who have, identified or have been identified with a person with some sort of substance use disorder or mental health disorder, and kind of helping be part of that care coordination team and linking them to care, outside of the hospital as they kind of step down in services or step up in services, depending on how acute their care needs are. We've seen peer supports and recovery coaches in jails, in prisons, at the syringe service programs, just out in the community, setting up, we've seen here in Louisville and in Lexington, where community partners come together and have set schedules for mobile units and things like that, where peer supports are just in the community, engaging with folks, helping meet basic needs, whether that's food insecurity or clothing insecurity, if you will, or just whatever those basic needs are, and just meeting people literally and figuratively where they're at. Emotionally, mentally, and physically. And so all of these different types of settings, you see the value of peer supports, and not only the value of peer supports, but just the value of treating people with dignity and treating people with humanity, or in the lens of humanity, and that everyone deserves great care. Everyone deserves dignity, respect. And so we just continue to see this model or peer support, this profession, continue to grow. And I think thinking about as it grows, and thinking about other credentials or other professionals that have kind of grown in this fashion, like thinking about CADCs and things of that nature, one thing I think we need to safeguard against, and thinking about best practices, is how to not over professionalize the peer role, and how as it grows, we do have to have parameters, we do have to have credentials, we do have to have things in place. However, we can lose the value of that kind of authentic connection when we get over professionalized. And so just kind of throwing that out there too, to say, hey, these are some things that we've learned from other professionals, practitioners in the past. And so let's learn from our past and create a better future, right?
Thank you, Jeremy. Ty, could you tell us the difference between a peer support and a sponsor?
So a peer support, like Jeremy was saying, a peer support is a professional role and it has boundaries, whereas like a mentor or sponsor, they give you suggestions, and usually those suggestions are not just suggestions. You won't have to kind of take them. Whereas a peer support, it's participant driven. and it's a participant's goals, and you're there to support them and how they want to pursue their recovery and support that pathway for them.
Thank you. Jimmy, could you, the last time we did this talk, we hadn't gotten through quite so much of implementing the linkage and retention programs through HEAL, which is the program that the peer support specialists carry out. So this time we're able to give more of a description of how these programs work. So Jimmy, could you give us an overview of how the linkage and retention programs work?
Yes, absolutely. So like Amanda was saying, we have throughout wave one, which was in 8 different Kentucky counties, we have linkage settings and retention settings. So we had peer recovery coaches in both of those types of settings. So linkage settings, Jeremy kind of touched on this already a little bit. So linkage settings would be anything from a surrender service program, a jail, probation and parole. And in a linkage setting with the linkage program, the goal is to interact with participants at these surrender service programs, jail settings, wherever the recovery coach is placed at, and ideally enroll an interested participant in the program, so we can link them to medications for opioid use disorder, residential treatment, resources that they may need, whatever their recovery path is that the individual chooses. We can help facilitate linkage to that. So retention is more or less just what it sounds like. So at retention sites, that would be like MOUD clinics, OTPs. These are where individuals are already in treatment, and we have a peer recovery coach there, and they facilitate retaining the individual into the treatment, right? By barrier removal, providing assistance, providing that peer support like we're highlighting today. Anything that can keep the individual retained in that program, right? I was placed at a linkage site, which was the Franklin County Surrender Service Program. So there, I would interact with the frequenters of the Surrender Service Program, present them recovery options, resources, assist in helping immediate needs, like we had food available there, was donated, bottled water, etc. And the goal is to build that rapport through the peer support relationship, and then link the individuals to treatment once they're ready. And then if they're not ready, then we'll just call and check in on them periodically until they are ready. And if they're not, that's okay too. So we're going to be there and meet them where they're at truly, whether they're ready for treatment or not. So we were at 43 different sites across those 8 counties. We had 26 full-time employee recovery coaches throughout wave one. We had 915 individual enrollments, and 21% of those were successful linkages. So that's over a fifth of the total enrollments were successful linkages. So we're definitely really proud of that number for linkage in particular. Retention, we had 1,021 individuals enrolled. We also had SMART meetings that we facilitated with the recovery coaches that are employed at Voices. And we had over 11,000 attendees at the SMART meetings throughout wave one. Also, again, kind of circling back to the retention program. So I mentioned the barriers that individuals could possibly come into contact with or present to the recovery coach. Oftentimes it was transportation, housing, utility needs, communication barriers. So as these different barriers were presented, we were able to develop strategies to address more or less any barrier that we encountered. We actually developed a Voices of Hope transportation program where we employ drivers to get the individuals to their medication appointments or to residential treatment, or what have you, whatever they need to further their recovery journey, right? And we actually provided 5,826 rides throughout wave one. So that's almost 6,000 individual rides. Like just to fathom that in my mind, like giving someone a ride 6,000 times is like almost not even, I can't even wrap my mind around that. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done there. I'm sure everybody at Voices is. And it was a total of 232,700 miles. And that was 197 different individuals that we were transporting. And again, that's just part of that, retention program, and also linkage at times too, but more so the retention program. So the individuals are already in treatment, in a medication treatment or some other type of treatment. And we're able to directly either remove the barrier or help to alleviate the barrier until the individual can become self-sufficient and sustain their own barrier removal or not having any barriers anymore, right? And staying in recovery. So
That's great, Jimmy. Yeah. And so the majority of the rides in the retention program are to OTPs, to methadone clinics. Just given the challenges that some people have, especially in the rural communities where we work, some people would need to be transported across multiple counties to get into the only, OTP in that rural area. So, Jimmy, actually, could you just go ahead and speak a little bit further about how those programs were developed based on the input of the coaches?
yes, I was saving that for later, but let's go ahead and do it. Yeah, so like I was kind of alluding to before, so we had recovery coaches placed at linkage and retention sites early on in wave one, and they kept on being presented with reoccurring barriers. Like Amanda was saying, transportation was a huge barrier, housing, utility needs, and at first, even especially with the utility needs, when I had heard that as a recovery coach, I'm thinking, well, how is that going to assist the person in getting to treatment, staying in treatment? But if you think about it, if you can't take a hot shower, if you don't have electricity, if you can't keep up with your hygiene, it's really hard to work on your mental, physical health in general if you don't have basic necessities, right? But for transportation in particular, so we had a couple recovery coaches that kept on hearing this barrier. Oh, I can't get to my appointments. I can't get to my treatment pathway option. So those recovery coaches brought those concerns back to our management. We were able to work with HEAL to develop that transportation program. So that was directly influenced by the peer and the peer's relationship with the recovery. So if those concerns weren't directly presented to us, then that program may have never been developed. Same thing with housing. So another reoccurring barrier that I know that I experienced and heard from the recoveries was that they didn't have any housing. So how are they able to continue their treatment, right, if they don't have stable housing? So we developed housing assistance programs, emergency housing assistance, where we can help the individual get with hotel stays for up to 2 weeks. We could even help with deposits. So all of this was influenced directly by the peer that was interacting with the recovery and then relating this information back to our management. And we were able to develop the barrier relief strategies that have been really successful. So that was directly influenced by that peer support relationship.
Yeah, and so some of all the barrier relief strategies, the housing, the transportation, and the barrier funds were developed through wave one. So now, moving into wave two, all the agencies that have a peer support, those things will come with it. So that was a great outcome, and it was great for the recovery coaches to participate in advocating for that. Ashley, could you tell a story or a couple stories about participant success within the linkage program?
Yeah, so all my coaches work in the criminal legal system. So that means I have several coaches that are placed in jails. One story I was thinking of in particular, one of my coaches, they're at the Boyd County Detention Center. They work with a lot of the women inmates there. And there's just no sober living available for women in Boyd County. So that's been a huge barrier for them. One of the participants that one of my coaches was working with, she was in the job program they have there, which is a really great program. They get them IDs, birth certificates, social security cards, get them a job so they can have a job once they are released. And she had worked her way all the way up to manager. She was saving her money, and she was coming up for release, but she didn't have anywhere to go. And there was no sober living for her to go to. Her probation officer said that she couldn't go across state lines, so she was thinking she was going to have to leave her job she had made, leave the support system that she started to grow there, and come to Lexington to go to sober living. But she worked really closely with one of our coaches. They were able to actually apply for and get a housing voucher for her, which is very, very hard to come by. So I know that coach worked very hard to get that. And then the coach even worked with her to be able to, she's still incarcerated, so she can't go and look at an apartment herself. So the coach, went and talked to landlords, explained the situation very carefully, because a lot of landlords might just want to turn somebody away like that because of their record. But, just this coach's hard work, and with the participants' hard work, she's been able to keep her job. She had that house to go to, because leaving jail is a really, really high risk, dangerous time for our participants. They've lost their tolerance, and if they go out and use again, they're at really high risk for overdose and death. So being able to not have that stress when you're leaving of, I have nowhere to sleep tonight, to be able to go into your own home, that removes so many barriers and stresses and really sets somebody up for success.
Thank you, Ashley. Ty, would you speak to a success in the retention program?
I think the biggest success that we had in the retention program is a participant. She came in about 8 months ago, and she really wasn't doing what she needed to be doing, and she really didn't want to do recovery coaching, but the coach was just very nice and friendly and welcoming every time she saw her, and eventually kind of wore her down to have her sign up, and she did, and they made goals together. And within 6 months, this person ended up moving with help from Voices. They received transportation and eventually got their own car because of Voices, and then went and got their peer support certification and ended up getting a job in peer support all in 6 months, just with working with the recovery coach. Now, this is a amazing story, so it's not like that's always going to happen, but this is what happens when a participant leads, and we just support them.
Thanks, Ty. So one of the major functions of peer support specialists is to help someone increase their recovery capital, and community recovery capital is one type of recovery capital, and it refers to the degree to which the community is supportive of recovery. But certain recovery pathways are more stigmatized in our communities than others, and so one of those, of course, would be medications for opioid use disorder, particularly methadone and buprenorphine. So Ashley, could you talk about some of your own experiences of stigma related to being on medication?
Yeah, I mean, stigma when I was on methadone, that was really one of my biggest barriers, because I had to hide that I was on it from my parents, from where I worked, and having to do that in secret just made it so much more harder. But, and then my parents, they finally did find out. And once they did, I'll never forget, the first thing my mom told me was, oh, now you're never going to go to college because those people don't do those kind of things. But, I did graduate college, but, my parents, they felt that way. It was mostly out of ignorance. They just did not know. And I, at that time, didn't really know how to explain it to them either. But what bothers me more is when I see, other people in recovery that are stigmatizing people on medication, because they know exactly where I've been. They know that this is literally life or death. And I don't understand how you can stigmatize somebody who's trying to save their own life. I mean, when I hear people saying they're against medication, it makes me feel like they're okay with me literally dying if I can't fit into their definition of what recovery is. Because recovery is so many things, and we should really be just supporting each other. We need people who aren't on medication in recovery to be our allies instead of fighting against us, because we're all here for the same reasons, trying to do the same thing and just trying to survive.
What about you, Jeremy? Would you share experiences you've had with stigma related to medication use?
Sure. I used methadone as part of my treatment for opioid use disorder multiple times throughout the last, I guess, 21 years. And a lot of what Ashley said rang true for me as well. And even thinking about further back, a lot of my friends who were in recovery, who I was trying to kind of attach to or build a stronger relationship with, who were in abstinence-based recovery or a non-medication tract, if you will, really, they didn't know. I kept it a secret too, Ashley, and that's part of the problem is we know that addiction is already an isolating disease, and then when we're actually seeking treatment and made a decision to move in a direction of health, then we have to keep those decisions secret and in the dark as well, and so that poses a big problem, and it posed a big problem in my life because I didn't feel that I had a community. We're talking about community capital and how I fit or we fit into the larger community. And I didn't feel like I fit anywhere because I would hear them make fun of people who were on medications for opioid use disorder, or I would hear them discredit, medications in general, and all of it coming from, not a medical or data driven kind of place, just coming from maybe a myopic view or just their own personal experience or bias. And so it really kept me on the periphery or kind of outside of a lot of the recovery spaces that I was looking and seeking to navigate. And it just furthered my feeling like I don't belong. That was already a underlying narrative in my life. And so that just kind of exacerbated that. And I never really felt attached to a community or to other people, and felt very alone. And that was not a great place to be. And I've since been able to have conversations with some of those folks years later, and not to shame them, but just to let them know, like this is what has been occurring, and how do we have these dialogues and be able to have differences of opinion, but be able to discuss it in a non-judgmental way, an adult way, if you will, with each other, and be able to have differences of opinions in our own treatment. You know what I mean? I am the expert in my life and you are the expert in your life. And we need to honor those things and honor any decision to move in the direction of health, regardless of how I see it or you see it. And if we can really look at and celebrate things versus trying to separate or look at the differences, I think that's a path forward, or at least the attitude that I've tried to adopt and practice. But it is very isolating, just to kind of rehash that. It's very demonizing, and it's not a fun place to be. And so continuing to be on the medication was a tough decision from week to week, month to month, as I saw the doctor and didn't really have support or really know where to go. And some of the clinics back then were trying to have some alternative recovery meetings, but they never really took hold. Like I think they, like I wish they would have, I guess I should say. But yes, thanks.
Yes, others have put in the chat that they had a similar experience of not sharing that they were on medications for opioid use disorder. So it certainly seems like something that, really affects a lot of people. And speaking of alternative types of recovery meetings, Ashley, could you tell us about MARA, like what that looks like, and just sort of about your meeting?
Yeah, so MARA, it's a support group for people who believe in the value of medication as a means to recovery. The preamble for MARA actually says that non-judgment is our code. Like, that's the biggest thing in MARA, is that, you get to define what recovery means for you. We don't like count the days like in traditional groups, because we don't all have the same definition of recovery, and nobody in the room is more important than anybody else. MARA was the I just can't say enough like about how huge of an impact that Mara had on my life, because like Jeremy was saying, like I felt like I did not belong anywhere when it came to recovery. I felt like I was going to have to, if I was going to recover, I was going to have to do it all alone, because I've lost my boyfriend. I had nobody else. I had tried going to meetings. I never fit in there. Another one, like the things with Mara, like the steps there, they don't mention like any higher power or God. So it's more inclusive of all belief systems. That was like another problem I had with traditional meetings. And, so that actually they had it the same night as the grief support group here. So I would come here for both of those meetings. And sometimes it was only like 2 or 3 of us in there, but just having like those 2 or 3 other people that weren't going to judge me. I could come, it was my place. I could come once a week and just be myself and get everything out. And I had never had anything like that before. It was just, like I said, I don't even know how to put into words like how important that was to me. And that's why now, even though after moving into this PC role, I still do a once a month meeting. It's like a step study meeting, because in Mara, there is the 12 steps, but they're, like I said, they're very, very different from the traditional steps. And yeah, I mean, I do that the last Thursday of every month, and we go through one at a time. And it's been a huge, huge part of my recovery. And I don't think I would have been able to make it through these past 2 years without it.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm glad to hear you had such a positive experience. Ty, could you share about SMART? It's another type of a type of recovery fellowship.
So SMART stands for self-management and recovery training. SMART is not just a mutual support program. It's a science-based approach emphasizing self-empowerment and self-reliance. There's no lifetime commitment. You can decide when the time is right to move on. You choose how to personalize your own plan for a successful change. SMART can be used both as a standalone program or in combination with other recovery paths. SMART Recovery recognizes the only one who can become truly expert on your own recovery is you. So SMART, I led SMART recovery meetings in Boyd County for a couple months, and the impact it had on me was just seeing how the different pathways can combine and how it can really support a participant in their time of need. We didn't have like great attendance, but every meeting was very powerful, and we went over a tool each time. And as the facilitator, I learned something each and every time that helped my recovery. So I greatly emphasize like using the SMART books and going to SMART meetings, even if it's a virtual one that we offer on Thursdays. Caitlin Robinson does that. I would highly recommend it.
Thanks, Ty. So another pathway of recovery that is stigmatized is harm reduction. And although some people consider recovery and harm reduction to really be sort of on opposite ends of a spectrum, there's really a great deal of overlap between the definitions of harm reduction and recovery, with recovery reflecting a lifelong process of improving your health and wellness, and harm reduction often being defined as any positive change. And so we know that some people can have a harm reduction pathway of recovery. Jimmy, you were a recovery coach at, you said at an SSP. Can you talk about ways that you can work with participants who were practicing a harm reduction pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it kind of circles back to what Jeremy was saying about someone being an expert in their own life. So although my path is abstinence, and that's what I found success in, a lot of the individuals that frequented the surrender service program I was placed at, they may have been practicing moderation or looking to learn new ways to use in a safer manner. So we had harm reduction flyers, and a lot of you guys are familiar with it because we go over it in the MOUD checklist training now about safer injection practices. So we had those on hand early on in wave 1. We would often have individuals that would come to the window that had abscesses or had a lot of scar tissue. They wanted to know alternative ways to inject their drugs, right? But do it in a safer manner. So I could use that flyer, show them how to inject at different angles instead of, injecting straight down into a vein, and ease the angle, 15 to 35 degree angle, rotate sites. And to some individuals, it may seem like common sense, to rotate sites, but some people don't see the benefit in it. So other individuals may need to be educated. So I would often hear people say, "Oh, well, I haven't thought about just switching up my injection site as much." So it's practicing harm reduction in real time at the SSP, which I'm sure a lot of you guys will do if you're in settings like that where that's applicable. And again, just being there as a consistent support. I was there Monday through Friday. So if individuals came multiple times a week or even just once a week, that may be the one healthy non-transactional interaction that they have in their life that week or twice a week, right? So I often got a lot of feedback from the individuals and the participants that they really valued me being there every time they came. And I was just going to work, right? I was just going to work and providing that support. And yes, I do care about people and I want to see people succeed. But I was just there and just being that, again, like I said, that non-transactional relationship. That they were receiving support, but like they didn't have to do anything to get the support besides fill out an enrollment form. So I feel like harm reduction wasn't something that I was aware of, and how impactful it could be, and how much benefit there was from that type of recovery pathway when I started. But as I saw individuals practice safer injection practices, utilize SSP services more, and utilize clean equipment, sterile equipment, they were also hydrated further because they were like regularly getting bottled water. Like you can see the physical difference, and just how starting that habit of healthy choices, whether how small they can be. Like once you start making healthy choices, ideally you can, and sometimes people do continue them. So I could see that difference as I was there over the months.
Thank you, Jimmy. And Jeremy would like to add to this topic as well.
Yeah, really quick, just to kind of piggyback on what Jimmy said, just thinking about consistency and compassion and how they pay off. But when we think about recovery in general from a society standpoint, we've often, far too often, had a hyper focus on the substances, and i.e. the absence of those substances. And so what it really focusing on, excuse me, what are we taking away? And I think with harm reduction models and with trauma-informed care and some of the new models that we see, we're shifting the paradigm to focus on what are we adding to people's lives. And I think when we focus on what are we adding, not what are we taking away, like Jimmy said, that's when there is we forge this environment or this foundation for ourselves or for other people to then thrive and then continue to make decisions that are in the direction of health, or healthier decisions, or decisions that aren't just based on their usage. And then when we get into taking that a little bit further into the models that we are kind of creating now, we think about how that kind of impacts the community at large as well, and how we have recovery-oriented systems of care, and what are we really adding to people's lives, and how that helps them propel. A lot of people, are very successful because they have they have a short or a small win, and we often want to look at those big wins, if you will, in people's lives as markers of success. And oftentimes, when people have a little bit of progress, that is where a lot of motivation lies. It's not in the incarceration or the shaming or any of the things that we saw in yesteryear, if you will, but it's more about how are we just wrapping more services, how are we enhancing people's lives, and really just there to support no matter what.
I wanted to, we have great answers. I'm just trying to look and see which direction we should be going into now. So somebody mentioned I think it was Jimmy mentioned the training that the peers go through at Voices for the Healing Community Study. It's very extensive. It's around 120 hours. It goes beyond, receiving the peer support certification into things like a Recovery Coach Academy. The peers learn about harm reduction, about, things like suicide prevention, just, a variety, working with human subjects, so working with, the research studies, but also there's pretty extensive training on the medications for opioid use disorder themselves. And Jeremy does a lot of our trainings. And so I wanted to let him sort of speak to kind of how he uses best practices for training peers in this situation.
Awesome, thank you. And I want to add something about that kind of ties into this. In best practices, thinking about the telephonic support or telephonic recovery supports that Jimmy and the others were talking about earlier. When we think about best practices with peers or recovery coaches, there's some research out there that talks about follow-up calls and engagements, and I think that's one of the key components and a best practice of this whole program is the number of touch points or the number of contacts, and just continuing to follow up with people. And the research shows us that people that just get a once a month phone call with somebody who's been trained in motivational interviewing, and it's just a checkup call for people. Those people that engaged in those calls or received those calls were adherent to their treatment plans at a much higher rate, and they also re-engaged in any kind of services that they might need as a result of a reoccurrence of their symptoms at much smaller intervals. So they were re-engaging in treatment, re-engaging with their coaches a lot faster than those that were in a control group that didn't have those calls. And so just thinking about motivational interviewing, thinking about the different touch points and how that kind of translates to training as well. And so motivational interviewing is a key component of the trainings, and how we incorporate just the compassionate conversation and how we weave in our lived experience and things of that nature are really key components and best practices. But also thinking about the parallel or the correlation between how our participants, clients, patients have better outcomes when they have more touch points. Same is true with our staff. When we have regular supervision, when we have regular trainings, when we have ongoing trainings, and that's one thing Voices and Heal, this is an example, KY Open, like there's continual education, there's continual professional development, there's continual touch points where it's not just go to your 30-hour training, get your certificate. At some point in the year, we're going to send you to a 6-hour training so you can get your CEUs and keep your credential, and all of the rest of the time we're just grinding and doing the work, and oftentimes getting burnt out. And so I think that's one key component to this training, is that it is robust and front loaded with that 120 hours, but is also a continuum of training and development that is very unique, especially to the peer role and to the recovery coach role. And so one thing about the MOUD flyer training is how we incorporate not only the motivational interviewing, but engagement styles using our lived experience, how sometimes using our lived experience can be harmful, even though our intent is to maybe instill hope or give somebody a tool from our story. How we do that, if we do it with permission, without permission, in the context of the conversation and things like that, are all things that we talk about in these trainings. And then we also talk about a little bit about bias as well, thinking about best practices. How are we continuing to have these conversations about our bias, our own biases that we have? Because there's a thing in social work or in this field called positionality, and positionality talks about how we approach our work through our lens of our own worldview, our own race, gender, things like that, and how when we are within these systems, how are we navigating, or how are we even in relationship to power or to the system? And so we see things through our own lens first. And so when we think about medications for opioid use disorder and the stigma that's attached to that in society, and a lot of us that might have gone through the training also have experience with these medications. So we are going to always come first with our lens from our own experience. And so really having that conversation up front in these trainings about, we know we have experience, there's people here with experience, and we're going to ask you to set aside that experience during this training, and we're going to present you with facts and nothing but facts. And we will also talk about if your experience differs or your opinion differs from anything that we're talking about here, and really massage that out and tease that out and see what that's about. And so some of those things those weren't from the beginning of the training. That wasn't an intention, or that wasn't really even a part of it, was it, Amanda? These things have just kind of nuanced and kind of grown as the training has grown, and just thinking about how we weave in, frequently asked questions, when people are asking questions, and teaching folks with the motivational interviewing kind of lens to be curious and not just necessarily answer a question, because oftentimes underneath that question is an unmet need or another question that's not being asked. And sometimes that might have to do with rapport, not being built yet, or it might just be because the people that we serve have been forgotten about, ostracized, oppressed, not listened to for so long that's their angle of kind of getting their need met or asking questions is in an indirect way. And so part of our job is to use those motivational interviewing skills and be curious about what they really are wanting to know about the medication, or what they're wanting to know about the processes or anything like that. Because ultimately what they want to know is, can they trust us? And so how do we build that and get to that is a key component. And I think another thing that we talk about when weaving in kind of best practices and motivational interviewing into the MOUD flyer training is something I always call real play. So instead of doing role play with the motivational interviewing and some of these frequently asked questions, we ask the participants in the training to come up with a real life scenario, so that as they are talking and we are going through and people are practicing the skills of motivational interviewing, that it coagulates in the brain of like how that actually works. Because it's amazing to listen to the feedback when we debrief from these breakouts, when people utilize a real scenario in their life and oftentimes come up with their own solution right there in training. And so it's a really beautiful thing to watch people not only learn a new skill, but also have a takeaway in their own personal life and in their own personal and professional development, just from those real plays. Where if it was a traditional role play and someone's playing a role, our focus is playing a role, and sometimes even the roles can even get kind of perverted, and we can have fun with it, and it can take a left turn in Albuquerque, if you will. And so really having those real plays, and then how the training itself kind of builds upon each other, and is really important to starting out with the motivational interviewing and really setting the intention for the participants or the cohort to be thinking of the lens of how do I incorporate these skills in the work that we do. And then that's when we talk about the frequently asked questions and we go over the flyer, all of the facts about MOUD and all of the nuance of how you obtain access, the different requirements for the different types of medications, and then how do we describe the different kind of tracks and how we aren't trying to make one medication better than any of the others or worse than any of the others, and how do we stay in this kind of state of neutrality when it comes to that, and our jobs are to give people all of the information so that they can make an informed decision about their life, and then we can support them in a compassionate way that also has accountability, but really it's about the relationship. So much of our society and so much of this field sometimes can be transactional, and so how are we really being relational, and how, like, all of this training builds upon each other, very nicely. And then we do role plays where we do pretend that we are at a SSP or a different kind of service delivery area and go through, and then me and Amanda and oftentimes Jimmy will give feedback, and it's a learning collaborative, and it's really cool because I always, as a facilitator, I always walk away every day from those trainings with a new kind of aha moment or learning myself. And so we're all learners and we're all teachers in this environment. And I think that's another part of the trainings that we don't talk about a lot, and think about best practices of how do we foster an environment where we are all learners and we are all teachers, to where there's not this I am the expert and you are the pupil environment. Some of us might have more experience or more education or things like that, but it doesn't put us on this unequal ground, if you will. And I think that's an important part that we kind of forge in these trainings as well. Do you have any follow-up questions about the training, Amanda? I feel like there's so much to the training that yeah.
Well, I'm gonna ask Ty if she will share just sort of one of her coach's experiences coming from the training, and then maybe we can come back with some follow-ups.
Yeah, so I had a coach that started about a year ago, and when he started, he came through a faith-based treatment program. And even though he was hired on at Voices and believed what we believed, he really wasn't sold on MOUDs and people utilizing MOUDs. And through the 2-day training and the preps, he gained so much knowledge. And then through working at buprenorphine clinics and OTPs, he just saw so many people who were doing just as well as him or doing better than him on an MOUD, and realized that, like, abstinence, MOUD, harm reduction, it doesn't matter. Like, everybody's pathway is different and they're all equal. And he expressed it so much better than I'm expressing it right now. We had an in-person team meeting on Friday, but he really learned just that everybody is equal and it doesn't matter what your pathway is. And that was really eye-opening for him. And I was very proud to hear that. And yeah, thanks.
Jeremy, can you talk about, of course, with peer support, a lot of it is sharing your lived experience, but sometimes your lived experience in some ways may not be helpful to a certain situation, if that makes sense. So maybe you did have a bad experience on methadone. And so what would you, how do you think about what to share? So could you talk about that, Jeremy, about how you can train on like discretion in the ways to use lived experience positively?
Yeah. Just thinking about our lived experience. That is, thinking about peer supports and recovery coaches. I mean, that is, a major component of the credential. That is one of the major components that allows us to build rapport and build rapport in a very fast and unique way versus other professionals or paraprofessionals or providers. And we have to also be exposed to the idea that sometimes our intent is to help, but the impact of how and when and what we share can actually be more harmful than helpful. And so oftentimes we can want to tell a story or tell, part of our lived experience. And what can happen is the participant or the client the focus of the conversation can shift, where the client is now kind of caretaking us or being worried about our well-being or being, really caught up in our story. And we've lost focus of what we're doing there with the engagement. And we never, want to shift that focus from the client and from their needs. And oftentimes stories told in certain ways or at certain even times can lend itself to that. And so we want to be cognizant of some of these pitfalls that we can fall into. And sometimes when people are in the middle of crisis, our stories aren't always going to be the most helpful. Like we may have a similar experience, and oftentimes, it comes out of my mouth and it's something that I'm working on and will continue to work on. And I'm sure it's came out of all of your all's mouths at some point, is, just equating experience. Like, I know how you feel. I know exactly how you feel. Well, no, you don't. Like, my grandmother may have passed away and your grandmother may have passed away, but my relationship with my grandmother is probably a little different than your relationship with your grandmother. My life experience is different than your life experience, and how I regulate my emotions or how I have support or all of these different variables that make up that experience, it is not the same. It might be similar. And so how do we even just use that, how do we shift our vernacular to, just shifting a couple of words can change the whole impact of how we share our story. And so there are a lot of ways that I think we teach and we give examples and we give feedback throughout these trainings on what might be a potential pitfall or downfall of sharing that particular detail or that particular kind of juncture in the engagement or in the relationship. And something we also talk about in that is how do we, ask permission or even ask permission kind of passively, if you will, or indirectly, by just saying things like, an example might be, hey, I've had a very similar experience, and it was tough, but I got through it. And if you'd like to hear about that, I'd love to tell you. And so that gives the participant the opportunity to say, hey, not right now, or I would love to hear that. But it gives them the autonomy and the agency and allows them to still be kind of driving the conversation and allowing them to have agency in that and autonomy in that. And I think that's very important. And we often really get excited, or I get excited when I have that connection, when somebody's telling me something and I have a similar story in my brain. And what can also happen to us is we are so caught up in, oh my gosh, this golden nugget that I'm about to share with this participant is going to be the thing that turns the light bulb on for them. And I can get caught up in like, this is going to be a really great connection. They're going to love it. And our relationship is going to be so much better. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm now not listening to my participant. And so how that can be, very harmful as well. And so how do we teach active listening and how do we, teach that with our eyes, our ears, our hearts, our minds, and our attention and focus is very important of how we listen. And so when I'm thinking about this story, I'm not, or my lived experience, I'm not necessarily always listening or listening to understand. I might be listening to just respond because I got this great story that's just going to change your life, and that's ego, that's bias, that's all the things that we talk about when it comes to sharing our lived experience and how important our lived experience is and how dangerous it can also be, and really talking about the balance of that and the discretion and really kind of taking a step back and refocusing on the client.
Thank you, Jeremy. And so you mentioned it in what you were saying that, of course, everyone is a teacher and a learner. There's always, more that we can learn about this topic. And we have been focusing on training peer support specialists and, like, in a way, teaching peer support specialists, but we have to also remember that peer support specialists also have expertise. So maybe it's different. Maybe some peer support specialists don't have as much education, some do, but the lived experience is equally as valuable. So it's just important to remember that. And also, Ashley, could you share some experiences you've had with some of your coaches being able to do education with agency staff?
Yeah, one of my coaches in particular, he was a coach at drug court, and he would give trainings on Narcan to the staff there. And he would come back and tell me, like, all these, he would get some wild questions from people. Like, somebody asked him once, hey, could you use Narcan as mace on somebody? But he really enjoyed doing that part of his job because, it was all these people, they were professionals, they were judges, they were all, like, listening to him sharing his experiences and educating them on something that they knew nothing about. And I think there's a lot of value that, especially like our peers, with how much training we do give them on MOUD, going into different agencies that maybe isn't like a clinic or, like an OTP, to be able to educate the staff there. Like, I was placed at an emergency shelter when I was a coach. And I mean, a lot of people, the other case managers there, didn't know things about MOUD. So I, had the opportunity to share what I had learned with them so they better understood.
Thank you. And so I'm going to sort of turn towards challenges that peer support specialists can face in the workplace. So I guess, Ashley, back to you. When we talked about this, you said boundary setting is a hard one. And so could you share about where you've seen that as a challenge and how that looked?
Yeah, I mean, boundaries is so super important in this job, and it can be really challenging, especially people who are new to this and they're used to how in, like, their recovery community that they're in, it's if somebody needs help, you help them. But here we have to have those boundaries. Like, you can't be talking to your participants at 3 a.m. Your phone shouldn't be on for them to be calling you. Some people get, some coaches get so, like, wrapped up in their participant that it can affect them. It can affect their own recovery, and it can affect everything on their whole life if they don't have those, like, firm boundaries set to help protect them and help protect the participant, because we're there in that role, and we need to make sure that we stay within it.
That's great. Jimmy, what would you say?
As far as challenges go, I know that when I was in that peer role, I was at a health department syringe exchange program, like I've said a million times today. And my role wasn't always defined. And in a way that can be a good thing, because a lot of people think that, oh, peer support's just there just to, like, link people to treatment or, like, check on how their treatment's going. But we can be that resource broker, and also provide support. We can do a lot of different things, but when I was at my placement, sometimes they would, like, have me do things, or, well, try to have me do things that weren't necessarily, like, in my role, like helping to clean things up or helping to, organize some of the supplies. And oftentimes it would take away from some of my time, like entering in data and making sure that my product that I was working on was complete. So it was really important for me to have those, again, boundaries for myself as a peer, to let the agency know, hey, I'm here to provide support for the participants, and also do my data entry so everything's recorded accordingly, right? And also, like Jeremy was mentioning earlier, you develop these relationships with the individuals, and sometimes you can become really close to them. Just through the work that we're doing, not even crossing any boundaries that have been set, really. You're going to develop that relationship. I mean, that's the goal, is to develop that trust and rapport with the participant. And I've had participants that passed away, and it was really tough. I had a couple pass away in a few month period. They never really got into any kind of treatment option. And they overdosed, and they're no longer with us. So that was a trying time, because it made me think about, how's my work performance? I also had that relationship with them, what could I have done different? But it's really important to be there and be consistent, but also don't hold the weight of what happens in a participant's life outside of your relationship. So making sure that you don't share too much of the guilt. Like you can care and be compassionate and be there and be supportive and consistent. But things happen, and that's the reality of this field, is that people do pass away, people do get incarcerated. Things happen, so it can be challenging.
Thank you for sharing that, Jimmy. That is hard. It is a really tough, those are all really tough parts of the field. And it sounds like, we have someone putting in the chat that they've also had that experience. So really sorry to hear that. Jeremy, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that face peer supports in the workplace?
I think a glaring kind of challenge in the workplace is, you spoke earlier about the value of our lived experience and how, in equating it with the value of other credentials or education. And I think sometimes being a part of a treatment team, or being in partner agencies and things of that nature, a challenge can be two things. Sometimes it can be our own confidence in these spaces as peers, as people in early recovery, building back our lives, things of that nature. I know I've experienced that throughout the years, and was a challenge of, where do I fit in here? But also that there's a responsibility on those treatment teams and on the larger, staffs and things of our partnering agencies to also understand and value that lived experience, and that there is a lot of gray area, or like Jimmy was talking about, sometimes maybe even role confusion. And so how, thinking about best practices, if you are going to incorporate peer support services into your model or into your service delivery, how are you educating your other staff? How are you educating anybody within those organizations on, what peer supports and recovery coaches do, the values that they add, and really, how to kind of, work within the continuum together, and really leverage each other's expertise, and not just devaluing and saying, well, we're looking at this through a clinical lens, when we know how complex substance use disorder and persistent severe and persistent mental illness is, and how many variables there are, that collecting all of the information and all of the data and all of the opinions and all of the variables from everybody on the team, that everyone has a voice and that's valued, I think is a big hurdle that we face in our field. And I think we've came a long way in the last decade in that. I think some other challenges, speaking to what Jimmy and the others have talked about, when we have deaths or when we are attached to these outcomes, what are we what are we deeming success, or what are those outcomes? And I say it all the time in the trainings, and we talk about it, is not that we aren't responsible for any outcome, but what we're responsible for is the intervention. And what we're responsible for is our attitudes and our beliefs and our advocacy and things of that nature. And so that is our marker of success. Did I show up? Did I show up with a good attitude? Did I do everything that I knew possibly I could do within the parameters of the scope of my work? All of these things are really how we should be looking at our work as peer supports, and then the outcomes are going to affect us. And so thinking about best practices when we do have deaths on our team or from participants, like as leaders in organizations, how are we then supporting one another and each other, through this? Because it's not that, oh, well, we all agree that we're not attached to the outcome, we're attached to the intervention, but that is not going to negate the fact that when somebody we're in relationship with loses their life, it's going to have an impact on us. And that impact is also can be transferred into the rest of the team, into our participants. And so how do we have plans? How do we have supervision? How do we have emergency debriefs and things of that nature that are built into our paradigms are very important of how we support one another. And how we support our peer support staff, and these types of things. And it is challenging, especially in a time of we're seeing more overdose and drug poisoning deaths than any other time in American history, or the world history, rather. And so the impact of the systems and of substance use disorder is in our face every single day. And I often say we do chaos for breakfast in the work that we do. And that is taxing. And so how are we, really building in those models to refill cups and really looking at peers as one of our greatest assets, and looking at just our staff in general as our greatest asset, and just thinking about any other kind of mechanism or tool out there. You think about electricians or folks, that work for the electrical company that climb the poles. Like, their employers give them the special boots that save them from being electrocuted if something were to go awry. There's all these safety protocols for all these different types of positions. And so how do we think about like peer supports and psychological safety and things of that nature as that for other jobs, right? So having these emergency debriefs when someone dies, or giving somebody an extra layer of support, or maybe even a little bit of time off if it was their participant to process that and do what they need to do to kind of get back in the game, if you will, is the electrician's work boots, right? That's our responsibility to build those safety mechanisms in for our peers. And I think that's a best practice that oftentimes can be challenging because the work is demanding and it's never ending. And I really like what Ashley was talking about those boundaries. It's challenging, especially if you come from any kind of 12-step background or any kind of community work. When that phone rings, we know that it's maybe a crisis, or someone's in danger, or someone needs us, and we want to be of help. A lot of us in this profession, or all of us in this profession, are here for a reason, right? It's a calling, it's a mission that we have and that we share. And so we want to be as helpful as possible. And we know, maybe from our own lived experience, I know from my lived experience, there was times where I reached out and called different people and didn't get someone to pick up that phone. And so for me, I want to be the person that picks up the phone for that person. But if it's 3 a.m, like Ashley said, or if it's continual, this consistency, like our consistency of being in their life is great, and that builds a lot. But if we're consistent in that manner, we can also be doing harm, because now we're not teaching our folks to reach out to other people. They are all going to be reliant upon us. And that poses a danger and a challenge too. And so learning those boundaries and learning why, and really understanding that we can't fix people, we can't fix everything, and how are we teaching, and even having those conversations up front. Teaching those conversations up front is important, of how do I, as a peer support, have that conversation with my participant of, you may call me at 10 p.m. and I'm not going to answer, and it's because X, Y, and Z. And when that happens, what are you going to do? What might you do? Who else might you call? Who else supports you? And how do we build that out for them if it doesn't exist? And that's part of the work, and that's a big challenge, because we want to be as helpful as possible, and sometimes we got to remember that intent versus impact.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Matt, for also sharing that he feels like maybe in his own position, the quality of his work also suffers when he's not taking time to reflect on interactions with his patients. And so thank you all to the panel. We've gone right up to the end. So I'm sorry, John, I'm giving you the 2 minutes for your announcements.